YouTubers. This will be part 2 of my series discussing slavery and the Bible, and specifically slavery in the Old Testament. In discussing Old Testament Hebrew slavery, I will discuss entry, legal status, treatment, motive, and exit, and demonstrate clearly what is sanctioned in the Old Testament is completely different and unrelated to slavery found in pre-Civil War America, or as slavery as we understand it. Starting with entry. Slavery as we understand it is usually overwhelmingly involuntary. This includes instances where humans are captured by force, or kidnapped, or sold via slave traders. The slavery system under the Mosaic Law was a voluntary system. Even though the word property or possession was associated with slaves, the property referred to their labor, not their persons. And slaves never lost their humanity. Hebrews were forbidden to treat slaves like other animals or possessions such as furniture. The Hebrews were instructed to love their slaves, foreign and Hebrew alike, and show the same respect as shown to free people. Hebrews were forbidden to use brutality in regards to their slaves, and slaves were to be treated as the same as free people. Slaves had the same rights and privileges as many of the free people, and slaves could own slaves and were paid wages. Foreign slaves had some of the same rights. However, the dietary, interest, and debt laws were not applied to the foreigner. Foreigners could become Hebrew, and then everything applied. There were time limits for Hebrew slaves and escape clauses that applied to all slaves. Slave trading was, as well as any other form of kidnapping, which included foreign enslavement, was illegal. The premise that foreign slaves could be enslaved against their will and lose their humanity under Mosaic law is a complete distortion of the Scripture, and anyone who argues that Mosaic law endorses the non-consensual ownership of people demonstrates an inability to interpret all the Scriptures that dealt with the institution. Quoting from a history of ancient Near Eastern law, a person can either enter into slavery or be sold by a parent or relative. Many of the documents emphasize that the transaction is voluntary. This applies not only to self-sale, but also to those who are the object of the sale. So to begin with, in discussing entry, first there's what we call the Great Escape Clause, found in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15. And it's a very fascinating passage. It states, if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand him over to his master. Let him live among you wherever he likes, and whatever town he chooses. Do not oppress him. Deuteronomy 23:15. Most commentators understand this passage, or this reference, to be in reference to a non-extradition of a foreign or runaway slave. That is, a slave in another country runs away and flees to Israel. Israel, under this verse and under this understanding, has to allow the runaway to live freely in the land as a sanctuary. It cannot extradite him or her to her former master. Commentators also note that this is an abstract contradiction to ancient Near Eastern law, culture, and international law at the time. No other nation did this. This understanding is restrictive in application. In other words, foreigners immigrating to Israel, and is argued on the basis of the scope of the allowance, that being whatever town. But it is not clear from the passage that it is to be taken as so restrictively, nor is the translation supplied, come to Israel, very obvious from the text, which means this passage is not as restrictive as many take it. So what we have here is an escape clause that says, hey, if you, Hebrew or foreigner, run away from a master, and as long as you stay within Israel, you are free and no one can return you to him or her. And this is exactly the understanding. A slave could also be freed by running away. According to Deuteronomy, a runaway slave could not be returned to his master, and he should be sheltered if he wishes or allowed to go free, and he must not be taken advantage of. Deuteronomy, again, 23, verses 16 through 17. According to a history of ancient Near Eastern law, this provision is strikingly different from the laws of slavery in the surrounding nations, and is explained as due to Israel's own history of slaves. It would have in effect turned slavery into a voluntary institution for both the Hebrew and the foreigner. So when skeptics say that those escape or freedom clauses from slavery does not apply to foreign people that were permanent slaves, Either they completely ignore Deuteronomy 23 or apply a personal interpretation that is not supported by the text. Second, slave trading or any type of forced enslavement, in other words kidnapping, was illegal. Forced enslavement was punishable by death. Anyone who kidnaps another and sells himself or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. Exodus 21 verse 16. Finally, skeptics imply that Israelites oftentimes were invading nations and enslaving people left and right. Again, skeptics are mistaken. Skeptics often use Leviticus chapter 25 verses 44 through 46 to support their premise, or to support their argument. I'm going to go ahead and read that passage now. Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46 states, "And as for your male and female slaves whom you have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you and their families who are with you, whom they beget in your land, and they may become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you to inherit them as a possession, and they shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you should not rule over one another with rigor." Now the skeptic goes on to explain, or to imply, that Leviticus 25 concerns conquered nations, which it does not. The Bible does make a distinction between slaves that sold themselves, as discussed here in Leviticus 25, and those who were enslaved through conquest, or war captives, as discussed in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 through 15. I am often surprised that skeptics don't use this passage more in their arguments. It seems to fit their positions better. But it should be pointed out that the scenario painted in Deuteronomy chapter 20 is a theoretical one that apparently never materialized in ancient Israel. It concerns war by Israel against nations not within the Promised Land, but since Israel was not allowed by God to seek land outside its borders, Deuteronomy chapter 2 verses 1 through 23, such a military campaign could only be made against a foreign power that attacked Israel in her own territory. By the time that these events would have occurred, i.e. Assyria, Israel's power had been so decimated through covenant disloyalty that military moves of these sort would have been unthinkable. But the scenario involved offering a peace to a city. If the city accepted peace, its inhabitants would be put to forced labor, but this would hardly be called slavery. It is also would have been used of conscription services under the Hebrew kings, 2 Samuel 20 verse 24 and 1 Kings 9 verse 15. If the city was attacked and destroyed, the survivors were taken as foreign slaves or servants, but the women apparently had different or special rights, according to Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 10. Under these circumstances, these were not slaves, or the Hebrew word ebed, E-B-E-D, in the proper sense of the word, but more vassals or serfs, or mas, M-A-S, or slavery for public institutions. However, it needs to be pointed out that this did not happen. Contrary to skeptics' assertions, which means all foreign slaves in Israel either sold themselves or were sold by their family members. It was a voluntary institution where the Mosaic Law applied certain restrictions that ensured all slaves did not lose their humanity. This is where Leviticus 25 comes into play. Now we will continue on in video number 3.